And we'll get started. So good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We're delighted to be joined tonight by Rabbi Daniel Feldman, a Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiva University and Rav of the Eretz Subject Community at Teaneck. Rabbi Feldman will be familiar to many people here from being a scholar in residence in there earlier this year. And we are very grateful that he is joining us remotely for tonight's share. And I'll hand over to Rabbi Feldman.
Thank you so much. It is a great pleasure to be back here in London, to whatever extent we can say that. And it's wonderful to be with you, even though when I finish tonight, you might not believe me, because you may have the impression that I'll say anything to be peaceful. And I wouldn't blame you, because that's essentially the topic that we're going to talk about. So I'll just say right now at the beginning, while I still have some credibility, that it's a true pleasure to be with you tonight and to reconnect to the London community. It was not so long ago, just a few months ago, that I was there in person. And it's where my roots are, where my mother is from, and it's wonderful to reconnect and to talk about an important topic, which is inspired by both the Parsha and also the calendar. We are now in Rosh Chodesh Tammuz, and we are beginning a month which contains within it the 3 weeks. We're hopeful that things are going to change in a lot of ways. We're hopeful that this whole crisis in which the world finds itself is going to reverse very soon. And we're also focused on our more long-term gullus, the exile that requires us to mourn over the 3 weeks, Shavasa B'Tammuz to Tisha B'Av. Hopefully that'll change. Hopefully there'll be a Mashiach. Hopefully there'll be a new Beis HaMikdash. There'll be a Geula before then, and we won't have to fast Shavasa B'Tammuz. We won't have to fast Tisha B'Av. But just in case we do, we know why it is. We know that it's because of our exile, because of our relationships. That's what the Talmud tells us, that it was sinas chinam, that it was unjustified hatred that got us evicted from the land. And that's what keeps us evicted. That's what keeps us in Galus. And we seek to undo that in order to be able to return. And that's really the theme of this week's Parsha. Parsha's Korach begins with the story of Korach's rebellion, of Korach's contentiousness, the machlokes that he caused. The Parsha begins, Vayikach Korach, and Onkelos translated V'espeleg, that he created a division, that he created a fight. And the Torah tells us that we should not be like him, that we should not be like Korach va'adaso, we shouldn't be like Korach and his congregation. And the Talmud suggests in the end of Maseches Sanhedrin that that means there is a prohibition. There is an issur in the Torah to be someone who holds on to machlokes, to be someone who not only starts a fight, but someone who fuels it, who keeps it going. And in fact, it's not only that we are told not to be like Korach, but as the commentaries point out, that it means we do have to be like Moshe. And we find that Moshe in this week's Parsha is ready to do whatever it takes to try to smooth things over, to try to quiet the fight. He reaches out to Korach and to his team. He's willing to suspend his own honor if that's what it takes. But that's not what happens. That's not the reception that he gets. But nonetheless, that's the attitude that we're told we have to copy, that we have to avoid the model of Korach, and we have to embrace the model of Moshe, who's able to seek out shalom, who's able to seek out peace, and to try to do what he can to undo this environment that Korach was creating. And it brings up the question, the halachic issue of just how far do we go? Just what steps are we allowed to take in order to undo a machlokes, in order to bring about peace or to maintain the peace? Because we do find within the halacha that there seem to be a number of latitudes that are given, a number of leniencies, which maybe shouldn't be viewed as leniencies. Maybe they should be viewed as obligations in the interest of peace. And one I'd like to just focus on tonight is the question of how do we balance honesty and peace. What happens if there's a clash between our commitment to always tell the truth, to always be people of integrity, and at the same time to being people of peace? And this is a topic which the Talmud discusses in a number of places. Among them, a passage the Gemara has in Maseches Yevamos, where the Gemara tells us three opinions. The Gemara looks to stories in the Bible, looks to stories in the Chumash and the Nach to find models, and first tells us that it's actually permissible to change the truth. I don't want to say yet to lie, because maybe that's a strong term, but lishanos is the language of the Talmud. It's permissible to fudge the truth in order to keep the peace. How do we know this? We look to the story of Yosef and his brothers. That the Chumash tells us in the end of Sefer Bereshis that the brothers of Yosef, who had sold him into slavery, and now finds that he is in charge, he's the vice king of Egypt, and they're in trouble because he has power over them. So the Torah talks about their reconciliation, about how they come back together again. And a part of that is the brothers tell Yosef that there was a deathbed instruction from their father, that Yaakov had said to them, make sure that Yosef knows he has to forgive you, which is a wonderful sentiment, but it's not clear that it was true. It's not clear that he actually said that, which prompts the question, is that okay? Is that okay for the brothers to say something not true in order to prompt this reconciliation? So says the Talmud, yeah, it is okay. And this is one opinion. Mutter lishanos bidvar hashalom. That in the sake of peace, for the purposes of peace, it is permissible to change the truth, to fudge the facts in order to bring about peace. So that's a fascinating license. And what's extra interesting is that's the first opinion of the Talmud. The second opinion disagrees. The second opinion says it's not true what the first opinion says. The first opinion maintains that it's permissible, it's mutter, to change the truth for the sake of peace. Says the second opinion, it's not true. It's an obligation, it's a mitzvah, l'shanos b'pnei hashalom, to change the truth for peace. Don't get the impression that it's an option, that it's something you could or could not do. I'm telling you, it's an obligation. And there's a lesser known story that is invoked to make the point, where Shmuel Hanavi, the prophet Shmuel, is given the job to anoint David as the king, Melech David, and he is replacing Shaul. And the Navi tells us that God commands Shmuel to do this and not to worry that Shaul is going to get mad and is going to kill him. That was Shmuel's reaction. How can I go do this? Shaul is going to kill me. So God says, don't worry, I have a plan. Take an animal with you, and the animal you'll bring as a sacrifice. And that will be your mission, and you don't have to say that you're going to anoint another king. So here you have it, that here someone is worried about maintaining the peace, and the plan that God gives him involves something that's not true. Now, it's not a lie. He did bring a sacrifice, but that wasn't his actual focus. That wasn't really the reason for his mission, so it wasn't 100% honest either. And here, it's not that we're endorsing it after the fact, or saying it's okay. That was the plan that God gave him. Apparently, this is the way you have to be. It's not only an option, it's a commandment. Now, some raise the question that, well, hold on a second. That wasn't just about maintaining the peace. Shmuel's reaction was, how can I go? He's going to kill me. Sounds like he was worried about life and death. If that's the case, so then it's pikuach nefesh. To protect life, you can do almost anything. So how does that show that you're allowed to lie in order to preserve the peace? So the Rabbi, the Sefer Be'er Moshe, has a fascinating point where he notes that here God is giving Shmuel this mission. It's safe to assume that he would have been physically protected. He wasn't really at risk of dying. But there's still the issue of human emotions. That the disharmony that could come from this offense that the king would receive, that wouldn't be addressed through physical protection. So there needed to be another strategy to deal with that. And that was this untruth or lack of 100% truth. So apparently this is not only okay, but it's sometimes a mitzvah. Everyone with me so far? So then there's a third opinion in the Talmud. And the third opinion goes further. It's not just okay. And it's not just obligatory. But you know what? You know who's even willing to do this? God himself. How do we know that God himself does this? Because this is a verse that appears in the Torah in Parshas Vayera, that the Torah tells us that Sarah, Avram's wife, heard that she was going to have a child. She was 90 years old and her husband was 100. Her reaction was, I'm going to have a child? How could that be? My husband is so old. And one pasuk later, right away after that, God relates this story to Avram, and it comes out a little different. And God says to Avram something along the lines of, yeah, Sarah's a little skeptical about this kid thing. She said something about old, kind of making it sound like she said she was old, when really she had said that Avram was the one who was too old. So says the Talmud, here you see God himself changing the story a bit in order to protect the harmony between a man and his wife. So this is a fascinating idea. How does it happen that our commitment to absolute honesty, which is crucial to our identity, right? We believe that the seal of God is truth. The Talmud says, anyone's learning Daf Yomi, this is a Gemara in Masechah Shabbos a little while ago. The Talmud says that the seal of God is truth. And we know that honesty is the best policy. It's not an expression, it's a pasuk in the Torah in Parshas Mishpatim, where the Torah tells us, Midvar sheker tirchak, stay far away from falsehood. So how does it happen that we interpret that as, well, sometimes? Stay far away from falsehood unless you need to keep the peace. How do you know there's such an exception? Where does the Talmud get this from? So here, this was a topic of much analysis. How does this happen? If we're obligated to tell the truth, we're obligated to be honest, how come there's an exception? How come to maintain the peace it's okay to not be so honest? So here you find two perspectives. One perspective is to say that maybe what we have here is a values clash. That it's true that we need to be resolutely honest. But we also have a mandate to keep the peace. That's Parshas Korach. We should not be like Korach, we should be like Moshe. So we have a clash between two values. And if that's the case, so then we have to figure out how to navigate between those two competing ideals. And we know that these two values are our pillars because of a verse in the book of Zechariah. The Navi tells us, and it's a significant pasuk, I think it's safe to say it's possibly the most famous pasuk in Zechariah. It doesn't have a lot of competition. But it's a pasuk which actually refers to the fast days that we're about to observe, Shavuos B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av. And we said at the outset that we hope we won't have to observe them. We hope there'll be a reversal and there'll be holidays. So that's because that's the message of a pasuk in Zechariah, where the Navi tells us that these fast days, the fast day of the 4th month of Tammuz, or the 5th month of Av, Tzom HaRevi, Tzom HaChamishi, all of these fast days, the day will come when these days will be observed as celebratory festivals. And then the pasuk concludes, V'ha'emes v'hashalom ehavu, and truth and peace are beloved. If that's the case, we can draw the conclusion that we have these two pillars, truth and peace, and we try to live lives that are always committed to truth and to peace equally. But what if we can't do both? What if they're mutually exclusive? What if there's a conflict? So then it sounds like we have the right to choose. If we're responsible adults, then we can say, all right, I can decide either to maintain the truth and not give an inch, or I can choose to maintain the peace. And that will mean that truth will have to be a little bit compromised, that it'll have to be less than 100% forthright. So that could perhaps explain the first statement in the Talmud that says it's an option, it's permissible to be Meshaneh B'pnei Hashalom. Why is it permissible? Because I have two equal values, truth and peace, and they're in conflict, and I have to choose one, and each one is a legitimate choice because they're equal. But what about the second opinion in the Talmud? It says it's not an option. It's not something you can choose to do or not to do, but it's an obligation. You have to choose the peace over truth. How do you come to that conclusion? Well, you could say that it's a values clash, but they're not quite equal. It's not really 50-50. Peace is more important. Or maybe it's not even a values clash in the first place. And we have to figure out, when we look at the prohibition of midvar sheker tirchak, stay far away from falsehood, how do we understand that prohibition? Is it absolute? Is there an isser in the Torah to ever say anything inaccurate? Or does it have some exceptions that are built in? It's interesting, and it's a topic of much discussion, that the language of the Torah here is unusual. Torah doesn't say, thou shalt not lie, lo tishaker. There are many different words. The Talmud says there are 4 different words that Torah uses for a language of prohibition. And here the language is tirchak, stay away. So what does that mean? Why is the language different than a normal prohibition? So here you find the whole range of opinions. There are some, like the Sefer HaChinuch, who say that this is a super prohibition. It's a more intense prohibition. And therefore the Torah says not only don't, but don't even come close. The language the Sefer HaChinuch is meirov tiuvo. It's so repulsive that the Torah uses more extreme language, don't even come close. While there are others who go on the other extreme, and they say that no, it's not that it's a more extreme prohibition, but maybe it's actually a less absolute prohibition. And when the Torah wants to tell you something is completely impossible, it says don't. And here it says avoid, tirchak. And maybe that's to suggest that there are built-in exceptions, that there are scenarios where it may be more important to focus on another priority. So if that's true, it might be that when the motive is shalom, if you're trying to help, so maybe the prohibition of midvar sheker tirchak doesn't even apply. There is an extensive discussion as to what exactly is the scope of this prohibition. One could compare it to civil law. And I assume here American law and British law would be parallel. That if I were to lie right now sitting in the United States where I am, if I were to tell you the sky is green, so that may not be true, but it's not a crime. In fact, in some cases, it's a basic requirement for higher office. It's not something I can be prosecuted for. When does it become a crime? Two scenarios. If I lie in an official setting, in a court setting, it's perjury. Or if I lie in a way that hurts someone else, let's say if I steal money from you through deception, that's fraud, that's a crime. So some understand that the halacha parallels this, that the prohibition midvar sheker tirchak in an absolute sense. So maybe that's like perjury. Maybe it refers specifically to bezdin. That's what we're talking about in a courtroom setting. Or the view of one of the great Rishonim, the Sefer Yereim, is that maybe it applies specifically when it's harmful, like when you're defrauding somebody. Then it's a prohibition, that maybe we should perceive it as an avera ben adam lechavero. It's an interpersonal transgression. It's about the negative impact that it has on someone else. And if what you're saying is not hurtful, it's helpful, it's beneficial, so then it's not subject to a prohibition in the first place. Now, that's not to be casual about dishonesty. There's no question that we still maintain that God's seal is truth, chosamto shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu emes. And it's true as well that we have many indications throughout that honesty is one of our core crucial values. But it may not express itself as a prohibition when it's up against another value such as shalom, such as peace and harmony. So that gives us two perspectives on this question. How exactly should we relate to this idea? Why is it that if lying is prohibited, why are we allowed to compromise the truth for the sake of harmony? One way is to say that there's a values clash there, there's a conflict, and we reluctantly have to choose one and we'll choose harmony. Or it could be, no, it's not even a values clash. That in this case, when one is motivated by maintaining shalom, then we don't even have the prohibition of sheker in the first place. So what difference would it make? How would this affect the bottom line? Well, one question is the question the Talmud debated that we saw. Is this an option? Or is this an obligation? Is this something you can choose to do? Or is this something that actually is not your option? It's something that you have to do when the circumstances present themselves. So this seems to be a debate not only in the Talmud, but in the later generations, also a debate among the Rishonim. That here we find a discussion of another passage in the Talmud. In the second parak of Bav Metzia, the Talmud discusses that if you find some lost object, you have to return it. But you shouldn't just trust whoever comes and claims it's theirs. Maybe they're not telling the truth. So therefore, you have to investigate a little bit. Adrosh achicha, says the Torah, Yidarsheyu, you have to examine a little bit. You have to ask the person who's coming to claim it, you have to say, show me some proof. Tell me, what do you know about this item? Give me some indication that you are familiar with it more than the average person. In that context, the Talmud says that that's true in general. Somebody comes to you, you don't know anything about them. Maybe they're lying, maybe they're claiming property that's not theirs, so then you have to examine them. But if the individual is a Talmud Chacham, if he's a Torah scholar, so what do we expect of a Torah scholar? We expect him to be honest. It's the language of the Talmud here, Eino Mishane B'diburo. He doesn't change his language at all. He's going to always tell the truth. So if that individual comes and says, that watch is mine, we can believe him just on his inspection. He can look at it, Tfias Ayin's language of Talmud, he can look at it, and he could say, yeah, that's mine, and we'll believe him. So in that context, the Talmud says that it's important that we should only give this privilege to somebody who is known to be honest, has a reputation for integrity. And there are certain situations where somebody can say something not 100% true, and that won't hurt their reputation. It's legitimate. That they could say things that are a little bit inaccurate, and they'll still be considered an honest person. And the Talmud gives 3 examples. One of them is achsanya. If a person was hosted well by somebody else, he had a terrific meal at somebody's house, and the next day people are asking him, wow, you look like you had such a wonderful meal last night. You seem so happy. Tell me, where did you eat? And you're afraid that if you're going to tell people where you had this great meal, so then they're all going to descend upon this person's house. The host who was so gracious to you is not going to have a minute's quiet. So in order to protect that person, so you don't tell people the truth about where you got your meal, okay, that's legitimate. You're trying to protect somebody who did you a favor. Second category, says the Talmud, is mesechta. Refers to a tractate, that if somebody asks you, did you learn this tractate? Are you well versed? Are you a scholar? So then you're allowed to play it down and say, no, I didn't learn it. Sounds like that's an expression of modesty. If a person wants to play down what they know, so then that's permissible. To be modest is not something that's considered to be dishonest. If you want to go in the other direction, that's a problem. You want to say, more than you do. The Talmud elsewhere says that's a problem of getting false honor. But if you want to play it down, that's acceptable. That's the second category. And the third category sounds like it's a whole discussion how to interpret it. It sounds like if somebody is asking intimate questions about the husband and wife's relationship, it's none of their business. You don't have to answer accurately about that. And that probably is a larger category, that people are asking you questions about something that's none of their business. You're not obligated to give a complete, detailed, accurate answer. Okay, so the Talmud gives us these 3 categories. It's permissible to say something not true in these cases, and you still will be considered an honest person, will still give you the credit of your claims. So the Rishonim ask, the commentaries ask, there's something missing from the list. What about Shalom? What if somebody wants to compromise the truth for the sake of peace? How come that's not on the list? So the Rishonim raised this question, and one answer is that Tosfos on the side of the page of the Talmud says it's not on the list because it is the list. The whole list are all examples of lying for the sake of harmony. You don't want people to descend upon the host who was gracious to you and cause all kinds of tensions. That's for the sake of peace. You don't want to have to discuss private matters that are not anyone's business. That's for the sake of peace. What about Masechta? So we said a minute ago that's motivated by modesty. Maybe that's also motivated by the sake of peace. I remember I once heard Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, speak, and the rabbi of the shul in which he was speaking gave him a big introduction. And when he got up after that introduction, he told the story about his grandfather, the famous Reb Chaim of Brisk, that Reb Chaim had a practice if he didn't want to get into a fight with someone, issues of learning. So instead of arguing, he would say, I can't fight with you. I didn't learn that Masechta. And that was how he removed himself from the fight. So he had a younger brother who was less renowned. And this younger brother copied that practice. He also would tell people, I can't argue. I didn't learn that Masechta. So the father of these 2 brothers, the Beis Halevi, the original Rabbi Shaber Soloveitchik, said to the younger brother, he said, that device that you use, that tool that you say, I didn't learn this Masechta, so I can't fight with you, you shouldn't do that. So the brother said, why shouldn't I? Chaim does it. You don't stop him. And the Beis Halevi said to the brother, he said, yeah, but when you do it, they'll believe you. So better not to use that technique. So Rav Aaron went on to say that this rabbi gave him a great introduction. He doesn't want to argue with the introduction because he was afraid that people would believe him. But what emerges from this story is that Rav Chaim related to this also as an example of peace, that somebody would say something not true, motivated by a desire to stay out of a fight. So that's how some of the commentaries say the reason you don't find peace on the list is because these are all examples of Shalom. But other Rishonim, the Rush and the Rif, they say a different approach. And they say the reason you don't find Shalom on this list is because these are all discretionary. This is a list of areas where one could say something not true because they decide that that's the approach to take. But in the case of Shalom, when it comes to harmony, it's not discretionary. Then it's an obligation. That's a mitzvah. So then that's not up to you. So why do we have to have the Talmud tell us that, oh, if you do what you have to do, it's not going to affect your reputation? Of course not. You're obligated to do that. So therefore, it's not on the list because it's obvious. That's how some of the Rishonim understand. So we see that for practical purposes, there are some who maintain that this is an obligation, that that's the opinion that prevails, that this is something one has to do in order to maintain the peace. However, there are others who would seem to disagree, among them Maimonides, the Rambam, that the Rambam seems to say that it's permissible, that it's an option. And maybe this reflects a general issue here, that the Rishonim who say it's obligatory, they feel like there's no issue of sheker here. There's just the mitzvah of shalom of Parshas Korach. That's all that is in front of us. So there isn't any tension here. That's the only path to take. But others, such as the Rambam, perhaps they understand that no, there is a tension. There is a prohibition to lie that is active at the same time. And if we're forced to choose, okay, so then we'll choose harmony. But it's an easy choice, and therefore maybe one also might decide not to go down that path. And that could affect other things also. For example, what about the issue of what kind of falsehood are we talking about? We noted before that the Talmud doesn't say l'shaker, doesn't say you can lie. It says l'shanos. Maybe that's precise language, that maybe the Talmud here doesn't want to say you can overtly lie, say something completely false. It means you can say something that's not 100% in the spirit of full disclosure. But to actually say false words, maybe not. And indeed, if you look at the Rambam's language, when he mentions this license, the Rambam understands it as mutter lahosif uligroa. That he says it's permissible to add a little bit, to take away a little bit. He doesn't say you can lie. He doesn't even say l'shanos. He uses very guarded language. And maybe that's to suggest that it's really a very begrudging license. And if you're going to do this, then fine, keep it at a minimum. And don't say something completely false. Say something that's not 100% the same standard you would have to maintain, let's say, in business, where you'd have to have full disclosure. Here, something less than that is acceptable, but only with hesitation and not to allow genuine falsehood. So this seems to be a debate. The Chafetz Chaim in his Sefer on Lashon Hara writes that ideally one would indeed avoid absolute falsehood, but only permit if 100% necessary, if there's no other path. And there are a number of other disputes that we can find in the later literature, which also seem to reflect this question. Is this a tension, a conflict between two values, and we're begrudgingly going to one? Or is this really not an issue at all? And Shalom is the clear victor. One might be familiar if you've gone to a Jewish wedding. Unfortunately, these past few months, we haven't been able to celebrate with others as much as we used to. But hopefully we'll soon be back to normal. Should be able to go to weddings and dance and celebrate. So we know that the song that is sung at the wedding, Ketza Meraktim Lifnei HaKala. How does one dance in front of the Kala, in front of the bride? They say, Kala no v'chasuda, a beautiful bride. What they don't tell you at the weddings is that's only one opinion in the Talmud. That is the opinion of Beis Hillel. But the Talmud records another opinion, the opinion of Beis Shammai. That Beis Shammai maintained, not so simple. So what if you're not so impressed? What if you don't think the Kala is so beautiful? Doesn't the Torah say, Midvar Sheker Tirchak? We have to stay away from falsehood. You can't say something that's not true. So rather, says Beis Shammai, Kala Kamoshi, say something that you can get behind. Say something you believe, but don't say something you don't actually feel. So we have concluded quite strongly on the side of Beis Hillel that we say Kala Na v'chasuda all the time, and the wedding bands, they don't even tell you the other opinion. But the truth is, the other opinion is hard to understand. Why should it be? Why should Beis Shammai maintain that you can't say Kala Na v'chasuda? Don't we see in the Talmud that everyone agrees that you're allowed to fudge the truth for the sake of harmony? So Beis Shammai is firmer than God. Even God was willing to do that. So where does Beis Shammai get their position from? So I saw once a suggestion in a sefer that maybe he doesn't phrase it this way, but this is how we could phrase the answer. That the issue is Beis Shammai lived a long time ago, before they had video cameras. So it wasn't the case that Beis Shammai, the members of Beis Shammai, they'd go to a wedding, and the videographer would come over to them with a camera and say, so Nu, what do you think of the Kala? If that would happen, Beis Shammai would agree, Kala na v'chasuda, beautiful bride. But, they maintain, if nobody's asking, so why should you jump in the middle of the circle and start screaming Kala na v'chasuda, something you don't believe in? If no one's asking, so then don't say something that's not 100% true. So what emerges is that the dispute between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai is that Beis Shammai maintains that you're allowed to say something not true in order to keep the peace if you have to, if you're forced to, if you're stuck. But if not, then you should avoid it. While Beis Hillel apparently maintains that no, it's more than that, that you're allowed to even take a preemptive strike, to act proactively in the interests of harmony, and to say something voluntarily in order to increase the sense of peace and harmony. And that seems to be the same dispute that we've been tracking here. And this could explain a few other points. For example, there was the view of the Yad Eliyahu, who maintained that this idea of being able to change the truth for the sake of peace says that's only true occasionally. But if it's going to be a regular situation, you're going to again and again have to say something not true, so then we wouldn't allow it. And that position seems to express that he thinks there is a tension here, there's a balance, that truth and peace are in conflict, and it's legitimate to favor truth or to favor peace, but they have to maintain their balance. So if on one circumstance you're going to say peace is most important, okay, but if you're going to say it repeatedly, so truth is always going to lose out, then the balance is going to be off keel. And this could also be expressed. There was a dispute between Rav Kook, originally used to live in London, and the anonymous scholar that he quotes. That Rav Kook, in one of his writings, recorded a debate between him and someone he didn't name, who referred to the idea in the writings of Maimonides and the Vilna Gaon, where they maintained that you should always follow the golden mean, you should always follow the middle path of all attributes, except if you're already at a certain extreme. You then will have to go to the other extreme in order to balance out. So in that context, this anonymous scholar said that the idea that you can lie for the sake of peace, that's true for the average person who tries to generally tell the truth. And once in a while has a situation where he's stuck, okay, then that person can choose peace instead of truth. But if somebody already struggles to be honest, if somebody is already not perfect in their honesty, and that needs to be addressed, so then that individual is going to have to go to the other extreme and be resolutely honest, and they're not able to take advantage of this license. And Rav Kook himself, Rav Kook disagreed. Rav Kook said, this is not an option. This isn't something you can choose to do. If you want to work on your attributes, you want to work on your midos, do that on your own time. But here you have an obligation to maintain the peace. It's not up to you, he said, to maintain that here I'm going to go the extra mile and I'm going to be so resolutely honest that I will skip my obligation to maintain the peace. So once again, it seems like these two sides reflect the two different perspectives on this issue. And maybe we can use these perspectives to explain one last point. There is an issue. Let's say somebody approaches you in the street and asks you for a handout, asks you for a tzedakah. And you don't trust this person, you don't feel they're a worthy recipient. So you don't want to give them anything. So the custom seems to be that one says to this individual, sorry, I don't have anything. And it may or may not be accurate, but we don't worry about it. We assume that it's permissible to say that because it's maintaining harmony. It's better than the alternative, which would be to say to this guy, you know what, funny you should ask. I have a ton of money, I just got paid, but I'm not interested in giving any of it to you, so I'm going to hold on to it. So that presumably would be quite contentious, and we all assume that that's not the way to go. And that's probably true. I think that is the conclusion. But it's interesting to note that one of the Rishon in the Sefer Hasidim felt differently, and he's quoted by the authoritative commentary on the side of the Shulchan Aruch, the Magen Avram. The Sefer Hasidim has a unique chiddush here. He says that the idea that you can alter the truth for the sake of peace, says that's only true for things in the present, or things that are in the past, things that have been already. But things that are in the future, or things that are in the present, that there is no such license. There you have to only tell the truth. Where does he get this from? It's not clear. The commentaries struggle. Some suggest that the rabbis felt we have to be very careful with this license because it can be interpreted too broadly, and one could say anything is for the sake of peace and allow themselves to tell falsehoods all the time. So therefore, we have to be very limited, and we could say it's only about things in the past, but not about the present or the future. But perhaps we could say a little bit differently, that maybe what the Sefer Hasidim is representing to us here is that, yes, it's true, it's permissible to change the truth for the sake of peace, if that's your only option. If you're stuck, that you either tell the truth or maintain the peace, then maintain the peace. But in this situation, there's actually three options. Either you could tell the truth, you don't want to give the money to this guy and start a fight. Or you could lie and keep the peace. Or there's a third option. You could give him a little bit and wouldn't have to compromise on either. And maybe that's what the Sefer Hasidim is saying, that if you only have two options, the options are set in stone, it's in the past, the facts are already set. So then you have the right to choose peace over truth. But if it's not in the past, it's in the present, you still have some control over the situation. So then better to pick a third way rather than to compromise either value. And it's an important sensitivity because even if that's not actually the policy as far as this specific question, it does sensitize us to the fact that we don't want to be casual about either value, that we don't want to neglect either peace or truth if we can, and we strive to do whatever is possible to not have to sacrifice either one. And it's interesting, if we go back to the original verse in Mishpatim, Midvar Sheker Tirchak, what does it mean? Stay far away from falsehood. Why does the Torah just say, don't lie? Why does it use that unusual language of Tirchak? There is a comment of the Lutzker Rav, Rav Zalman Saratskin, there's Naim LaTorah on Chumash, where he explains that the reason the Torah doesn't say absolutely don't lie is because there are exceptions. It's true that if one is motivated by harmony or something similar, so then yes, it's true they may be forced to say something not true. But what does the Torah tell us? It tells us, tirchak, that you should try to avoid such situations. Do whatever you can to honor both values. When you're stuck, you're forced to pick, so yes, you have the right to pick peace. But if you're not forced, if there's a third possibility, you should have enough appreciation for both of these values to do what you can to preserve them and seek any path that doesn't force you to compromise one or the other. And perhaps we think about it as we bring in the month of Tammuz, that's also what the verse in Zechariah is telling us. That we don't want to fast Shavasar B'Tammuz, we don't want to fast Tisha B'Av. We want a Geula, we want holidays on these days. And the pasuk says, yes, it's going to be the Beis Yehuda, L'Sas and L'Simcha, it's going to be days of celebration. When does that happen? V'ha'emes v'ha'shalom mehavu. That if we love peace and we love truth so much, that we don't want to give on either of them. We don't want to choose between our two children. We don't choose between our two parents. These are our two beloved pillars. If we esteem both of them and we live lives that do everything possible to honor both values, so that brings us one step closer to the time when those dates in the calendar, Beis Yehuda, L'Sas and L'Simcha, will be days that we will celebrate as festivals, will no longer fast and cry, and we will no longer be in exile. So just to quickly recap, we raised this question of why the Talmud says that it's either permissible or maybe obligatory to lie for the sake of peace, bringing various stories from the Chumash and from the Nach, and that even God himself did it. And we asked, why should it be true? What about our commitment to honesty? And we saw two models, that either there's a clash here and we have to choose, so what can we do? Or maybe there isn't really a clash because the prohibition of sheker wouldn't really apply under these circumstances. And we talked about how that could affect certain questions, such as, is it an option or is it an obligation? Are we allowed to say something overtly false or just to say something which is less than 100% in the spirit of full disclosure? Can we say something proactively like Beis Hillel with Kalanah v'Chasuda, or only if we're forced to, like the view of Beis Shammai? Is this something which can only happen once in a while, but if it happens too often, it brings us out of balance? And what about somebody who needs to restore a balance? Do we say that person is not allowed to avail themselves of this license? And the view of the Sefer Hasidim, that one shouldn't tell the individual asking for money that he doesn't have any. And we explained it by saying that if there's only two choices, yes, you can prioritize peace, but if there's any way to avoid the clash, take that path. And we noted that that seems to be the message of the Lutzker Rav. When he raised the question of why does it say midvar sheker tirchak, why avoid and not don't? Because the Torah knows there are times when it's necessary, but it's telling us avoid being in those situations. Do whatever you can to be able to honor both values. And we noted that seems to be the message of the pasuk, that when ha'emes v'shalom ehavu, when truth and peace are equally beloved and honored, So then that brings us towards the place when we can truly celebrate Shavasa B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, when we can hope for a full redemption, and we no longer have to cry and fast on these days, because we will no longer be disconnected from each other. We will be reconnected in every sense of the word. So I hope that that will soon be the case. We should have a redemption from our current crisis. We should have redemption from our long-term exile, and that we should all find ourselves reunited. I hope to be able to visit London in person again soon. I hope that we can all be together in good happiness and health, and that we should have a year of bracha, and most importantly, of shalom.
Amen.
And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rabbi Feldman. Does Rob have a minute for questions if anyone has
Yes.
anything to ask? If anyone does have any questions, please do take yourselves off mute and ask. No? Okay, well, we'll leave it there then. Thank you very much, Rabbi Feldman, for joining
Okay,
us
thank
this
you.
evening.
Best regards. Great to be in London, even virtually.
Thank you. Next week, we will be back at 8 o'clock, and we'll be joined by Rav Shon Rosner of Karen Biavne. And many thanks, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.